I feel like this ramp to get to the point where the AI is really starting to disrupt jobs is on a slower trajectory, which for scientists in the field is actually gives them an opportunity to adapt.
Thank you for listening to the Ask AI podcast. To get our latest episodes, AI news, discount codes for events, and links to free resources, sign up to our monthly newsletter by visiting askai.org and clicking the subscribe link. That's askai.org.
Hello, everybody. This is Elena from Ask AI, and I have a very special guest today, Eric Siegel. Eric has many amazing titles. He is an Ivy League educated biologist and computer scientist who has been working in innovation in machine learning in drug discovery, and also was a co-founding chair of a broad symposium on machine learning. He is a multiple founder. He is a board member, a gentleman, and a scholar. And welcome, Eric. And let's talk about AI in drug discovery. And the interesting thing is you have been doing it before it became hot. So
Sure.
exactly. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I started doing this back in like, I don't know, I want to say like 2016 or 2017, which is, you recall the sort of everybody's jumping on the AI ML train didn't really happen until maybe, I want to say like 2020, 2021 or something like that. And it was interesting, actually. There was a group at Google called Google Accelerated Sciences that was essentially out there going and finding companies that had interesting data sets. And I think it was somebody knew somebody and they bumped into somebody in line when they were first signing up for their first day of work. And they met somebody there and they're like, oh, you should talk to this group. And that happened to be my group at the company I was at. We ended up doing a project. It was wildly successful beyond anybody's sort of imagination of what was going to work in terms of
wait, what made it wildly successful?
Well, so one of the things predictive approaches to identifying drugs have traditionally had very, very low success rates. So I remember there was like this group that was selling their software for doing computational as opposed to AI-based drug discovery. And they were talking about, well, if you buy 1,000 molecules, maybe you'll get 5. And I was like, this was their sales pitch, right? This is their sales pitch is saying maybe you'll get 5. I'm like, well, thinking, well, maybe you'll get 0.5 is probably realistic. So we were expecting to see maybe something maybe a slightly better than that, but not, wildly better than that. And we ended up about, I want to say like 30% more, and in some cases higher than 50% of the molecules that we were predicting were actually active against our protein target.
So that was a wow right then and there. Back then.
Yeah, it was a surprise. Like I was like, this data must be wrong. There must be something.
As a true scientist, of course, this data must be wrong.
It worked too well. And actually one of the folks at Google who was sort of the head of that effort from their end said, usually we only have about 1 in 10 of these relationships with these companies work. Usually success just meant something usable came out of it. And then on rare occasions, it would turn into something that would go further, maybe a follow-up project or something like that. In our case, it was so good that we actually started a company based on it. That company got acquired by a larger company in less than a year. And then that company actually ended up hiring the two main guys from Google over to work in that company. So it was wildly successful.
Yeah. So it was a success, right? For machine learning, success for the founder, success for everybody, right?
Yeah, it was.
Even early days, AI showed promise in drug discovery, and then it started evolving, right? Yeah. And you were there at the forefront of its evolution. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Obviously there's a lot of companies that are claiming to do machine learning drug discovery. And particularly like I think Silico Therapeutics, they've been the most widely publicized about this, but there are others or several other companies there. I think in AI, there's always this hype cycle. And I think there was a hype cycle 4 or 5 years ago as this was just starting to kind of build, where you could get hundreds of millions of dollars in investment money. And there were actually lots of, I just remember doing a, competitive analysis in the space where there were a bunch of companies who'd gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in
Wow.
funding it to
For
do this
AI drug discovery. Yeah.
just for data and drug discovery. And I think what happens with those hype cycles is then the reality sets in, right? First of all, drug discovery is a very long process. So if you start on January 1st of 2020, it's going to take until January 1st of probably 2030 before you get a drug to market, even if it worked, so it's
Yeah.
hard to
Hard to
actually
get
show.
work on the money, right?
Yeah. So I think what's happened is there's sort of a more of a realization that these are tools. They're not going to cause the whole industry to shift overnight. One of the things that I noticed, and one of the things I have sort of pounded in talks I've given, et cetera, is about the fact that the industry really isn't set up, at least in this early stage. So I was working in this early stage, small molecule discovery. It really is not set up to handle this data. So for example, when you predict a molecule, you need to actually make that molecule in order to test it, or else, what are you going to use one predictive thing to prove another predictive thing? Like that doesn't make any sense. You have to actually make the molecules, and making those molecules actually is the slow step.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Because
So,
that's the real McCoy when you have to actually do it. Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
expensive. It takes time. And so the ideal situation is I want to take my data that I'm feeding into these models. I want to generate a model. I want to spit out a list of molecules. I want to make them. And then I want to iterate and do the next round of machine learning to start improving them, to find new things, etc. All of that takes an extremely long time in the world, given, compared to the speed of, say, that Chat GPT is evolving. Just the experiment
Yeah.
is taking probably, 17 generations worth of Chat GPT models before you can even get the answer. And so that's something that needs to be solved. I think this is a problem that can be solved, but I think it's a complex problem that involves logistics. It involves some very practical things,
And how are scientists adapting, right? Now the speed of AI is accelerating, all the hype, right? How are the scientists adapting? They still have to deal with some of the slow parts of the process and the fast parts of the process and report on the money they borrowed, or at least their management has to. How are they adapting to this change?
Yeah, I think like everybody else, it's I think there was this period of, oh my God, let's go back even further. 8 years ago, it was like, yeah, we're just gonna sit on the sidelines and wait and see if there's anything real to this. And then 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago now, it was it was like, oh, now people are starting to make some money. And then 2 years later, it was, oh my God, we're 15 years behind everybody else. So there was definitely this sort of like, oh my God, we have to learn how to do this. I think there's a period where we're sorting out which things are actually sort of immediately practical. I think there's a lot of practicality in sort of, for example, target identification. So the idea of identifying new proteins to go after that could be useful in certain diseases. I think that there's more practicality to doing that for many companies. And that's going to depend on, genomic sequencing and proteomics and multi-omic analysis. Whereas some of these more, higher risk things like predicting what the next molecule to test, et cetera, I think it's taking a little bit longer. I think it's harder to figure out what works for exactly the reason that I said is it's hard to actually validate your models if you
Makes sense.
can't actually, somebody has to be willing to spend a lot of money to figure out what works. And
Makes sense.
there's not a lot of people who are ready to spend a lot of money on what works when you're in an industry that is already spending a lot of money to find anything.
And that's also by nature a very labor intensive, very thorough, right? Very process with a lot of dependencies. So even though AI could fix some parts of the process, but not others. So that brings up a question, where in this process of scientific discovery is AI most helpful? Where could it really like take some grunt off of the scientist's hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately so I think there's a short-term question here and a long-term question. I think that, for example, LLMs are particularly good at synthesizing large amounts of material. So scientists do need to keep up on what is going on in their field, what is going on in their space, what are discoveries, etc. And I think that the idea that you could take this massive amount of data and information that gets published every year, I think that that's something that AI could really, really help. In other words, working in tandem with the scientists to drive forward understanding of systems. I think there's increasingly, I think, and maybe this is probably a bit longer term, although I think we're starting to see this as the ability to take large scale genomic information and potentially on the scale of the entire population of people anyway, that you could start to really do some very, very interesting analysis on a scale that was, of course, impossible only, I mean, whatever it cost billions of dollars to sequence the first genome. And now we're at the point where you can do whole genome sequencing for, I think, hundreds of dollars at this
That's
point.
crazy, right? And also an element of time, right?
Yeah.
Not only just hundreds of dollars, but very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. To the point where if you imagine, obviously there's ethics questions here
Yeah.
that need to be answered, but $100 a person is not inconceivable that you could do everybody. You
Yes.
could
If there
do,
is a will to do that, there is
yeah,
now a way.
yeah,
Very interesting.
right.
And then, of course, the next question is also kind of forward looking, meaning, how do you think AI is going to impact jobs in this field moving forward? How are
Yeah.
they going to be different? What's going to be going away? What's going to come in? Of course, we don't know what's going to come in, right? But
Mhm.
what do you think about that?
So this reminds me of there's this well-known blogger in the small molecule biotech space, at least. And I say well known, and then
Well,
I
just like
qualified it to this tiny niche, but you know what I'm saying. And he
in the
said,
community.
AI is not going to take the jobs of the chemists. He's a chemist, so he's talking about chemistry. AI is not going to take the jobs of the chemist. AI is going to take the jobs of the chemists who have refused to embrace AI. And I think
Makes
that
sense.
that quote has really stuck in my mind. I do think that people need to adapt. And I think this is true for everything. I do think there's an interesting distinction that I see in the way this is happening in the biotech world versus how it's happening in the rest of the world. Whereas I think the disruption was sort of almost instantaneous when it came to marketing, when it came to analysis of things more business oriented functions than scientific oriented functions. I feel like this ramp to get to the point where the AI is really starting to disrupt jobs is on a slower trajectory, which for scientists in the field is actually gives them an opportunity to adapt
Yeah, makes sense.
with a job rather than I think some of the other fields where you're going to have to adapt while also having, and again, I'm personally particularly optimistic that just like any technology, it's going to increase jobs over the long term rather than reduce jobs. But we're sort of still analyzing the world with AI as if it were the world without AI,
Oh,
right? Like,
yeah. And also, if we think about this field, the implications, right, they're pretty endless because it is from curing disease to inventing various different preventative measures to then longevity to many, many things, right? And you
yeah,
extend,
absolutely.
extend this far. So I think in this specific field, AI is,
Well,
I think is useful and kind of job enhancing, so to speak.
yeah, one of the things we were just talking about was genomic sequencing and how you could potentially sequence everybody's genome. But think about the fact that, okay, well, if everything is captured, what is there next to do? Well, think about the fact that every cancer cell in a tumor has the potential to have a slightly different genome. Every bacteria in your microbiome also has a sequence associated with it, et cetera. So there's actually this massive explosion of data that comes after you're able to handle the data that we can get readily. It's possible that AI can do all the thinking around that. I suspect that what will happen is we're going to all have to start to up our game, both in terms of using AI, but also in terms of, okay, thinking about what's the next question. What is that bigger question that you can now start to think about and answer now that the question that was so hard to answer before is not hard to answer anymore? I mean, it used to be, for example, from a DNA sequencing perspective, people used to sit in the lab with gels and radiation, radioactive isotopes. Then they'd put the film over the thing, and then they'd have to read it off one by one. That is not how it works anymore. But
Well,
imagine like all of those people who were spending all of this time, like huge amounts of time to sequence the DNA, are now just sending the sample out to a company who does it for far, far less than a penny for every base that they're sequencing, and doing it fast, cheap. And so it enabled the next round, the next level of information, the next level of analysis. And then this is obviously, I could be wrong. This could be the doomsday scenario that some of our tech quote unquote leaders like to bring into the mix all the time. But I actually don't think that that's the path of human development is not usually that technology reduces opportunity. It usually increases opportunity. I also think there's a lot of hyperventilation about what it is that AI can actually do.
well, yes, that is very true and all across, right? A lot of hyperventilation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this assumption that when AI shows some slight likelihood that it can solve some problem that it couldn't solve before, suddenly we think that it solved all of the problems that it couldn't solve before. And I think near-term AI can do amazing things. I think this is a Bill Gates quote I saw recently where he said, like, AI, we overestimate what it can do in the short run and underestimate what it will do in the long run. And I think that I agree with that statement. Is like, I think what we can do, what we think it's going to do is probably, in some cases, is what it can do. And it is disrupting jobs, don't get me wrong, but it is also not going to replace human beings.
And lab scientists who have to come
Well, somebody has to do
the
the lab
bench
work.
molecules to test the models. Makes sense. Well, thank you so much. This was
Well,
an amazing conversation with Eric Siegel about AI in drug discovery and the outlook of the jobs in this sector and the future of AI. So thank you so much, Eric, for this amazing conversation. And hopefully we'll have you over in a few months or so to talk about what's happening and how the future is looking then.
Sure, that's great. Thank you so much, Helena.
Thanks for tuning in to Ask AI, your guide to spotting opportunities and navigating challenges in the era of artificial intelligence. Since 2017, our independent nonprofit has brought together experts, volunteers, and innovators to share balanced insights on AI and the transformation of work. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking AI. You can access more free resources and subscribe to our newsletter at askai.org. That's askai.org.